Donald Trump
has won
the presidency for a second time.
Thank you very much. Wow.
The United States has a new president-elect who will take over next January, and he certainly has a long list of changes that he wants to make. So, what will Donald Trump's return to the helm of the world's most powerful economy mean for aviation, both inside of the US and in the rest of the world? Stay tuned. Now, generally I avoid discussing any politics on all of my channels because, I don't really like polarizing my audience for no reason. There's far too much of that going on anyway. But on the other hand, there is no question that the return of Donald Trump to the White House will affect the aviation industry, and that is what Mentor Now is all about. Plus, it's a topic that many of you guys have brought up in the comments. An example of that is that when I've been looking at Boeing's most recent troubles, some of you have suggested that Trump's arrival could be good news for Boeing, or that Boeing are simply too important for the US economy to be left to their fate. Too big to fail, in other words. Now, I'm going to look at some ways that Trump's arrival could directly affect Boeing in a few minutes, but first, are Boeing actually too big to fail? Well, there is no getting around the fact that Boeing is one of the greatest exporters of the United States, and crucially, the company has always been a key military contractor, which is a big part of why some of you guys might think that Trump or no Trump, somebody will always bail them out. But that assumes that Boeing still are as important to the US government as they've always been. And if we look at what they're actually making, there are a few problems with that assumption. Aside from the airliners that we usually talk about, Boeing are also producing some military jets. They make a couple of fighters, which they inherited when they merged with McDonnell Douglas. That's the F-15 Eagle and the F/A-18 Super Hornet. And if you look at those, age-wise, neither of them is exactly a spring chicken. The first version of the F-15 entered service in the mid-1970s, and whilst the F/A-18 is almost a decade newer, it was actually derived from a mid-1970s Northrop design called the Yankee Fox 17. And by the way, if you're familiar with the story of how McDonnell Douglas basically bought Boeing with Boeing's own money, you might also want to look into how they basically stole Northrop's Yankee Fox 17 design and then turned Northrop into a subcontractor for the F/A-18. Anyway, McDonnell Douglas and then Boeing have been updating and refreshing these old fighter designs in a way that's actually very similar to how they have been dealing with the Boeing 737. Now, there's a lot more context in the stories of these military jets, which I'm not going to have time to go into here, unfortunately. But the point is that while Boeing has recently won some contracts for the latest F-15, the Echo X-ray model, they haven't won any contracts for any all-new fast jet designs, apart from the T-7 Red Hawk trainer, which they're developing together with Saab, as well as some drone designs. Of course, Boeing also sell military derivatives of their airliners. The KC-46 aerial refueling tanker, which is basically a repurposed 767, the P-8 Poseidon maritime plane, and the E-7 Wedgetail AVAX replacement, which is a converted 737NG. On top of those, they are also selling a couple of 747 variants, the VC-25 Bravo, who will become the next Air Force One, plus the E-4 Charlie, that will become the next US Air Force Doomsday plane. But of these large jets, it's only the KC-46 and the P-8 that are made using newly built airframes. All E-7s made so far are conversions of existing 737-700s, although Boeing could probably make some new ones for the US Air Force for, an ongoing contract. But theoretically at least, if Boeing weren't doing these conversions, someone else could have made these military variants without them. There are companies making tankers out of existing 767s in Israel, for example, and Boeing aren't even in charge of the next E-4C Doomsday plane. They lost that contract to another company who is already converting some Korean Air 747-8s into that military role. Now, it is true that for a program like the KC-46, where the Air Force needs hundreds of aircraft, they still will need a large manufacturer like Boeing or Airbus. But future air refueling tankers might evolve so that they're not based on airliners at all, so this is far from a sure market. Now, Boeing has already announced the end of production for their FA-18 in the next few years, and if they're lucky, the F-15 might have another decade of slow production left. Beyond these, their T-7 trainer program has faced long delays, the KC-46 even longer ones. The less we talk about the next Air Force One, the better, and I'm not even going to mention NASA's programs that they're involved in. So I think that you're maybe starting to see the picture here. In reality, nobody in this industry is irreplaceable or too big to fail, especially if their track record has been slipping for a few years and if they haven't really been working on new, long-term projects that continue to make them valuable to their customers. And that's an area that hasn't exactly been front and center on Boeing's mind for a long time now, as I've covered in several of my earlier videos. Now, some people have pointed out that Trump has shown support for Boeing in the past. After all, it was under his previous term that the contracts for the F-15 Echo X-ray and the T-7 trainer were signed. But even with all the goodwill in the world, if a company isn't delivering, that just won't be enough. But for now, we're only really interested in the next 4 years of Trump's rule and what he will do. And he has certainly been quite vocal about what he likes, so it's not like we have to keep guessing. He has already announced that his transportation secretary will be Sean Duffy. This is the person who will be overseeing the FAA, among other things, and of course, he will also have to keep a close eye on Boeing and its recovery over the next few years, which should be quite interesting, but it's hard to say what difference that he will actually make. But one of the key areas where we expect to see some real changes in the new Trump era will be in air traffic control. That's a body that many are blaming for some of the close calls that we've seen in US airports over the past few years. But while we're talking about staying safe and avoiding close calls, there are also a few things that you should never take a chance on, and one of those is your online privacy. That's where today's sponsor, NordVPN, comes in. Not only will they keep your connection secure and encrypted, but they will also give you access to a whole host of online security tools like malware protection, ad blockers, and warnings if your Wi-Fi is not secure. Of course, they will also make sure that you can move virtually between almost any place on the globe, ensuring that you can access your own favorite content wherever you go, as well as show prices in your local currency, for example. I use Nord almost every time I'm out traveling, and if you want to do the same, they have a great deal for my viewers right now. If you go to nordvpn.com/mentornow, you'll get 4 months extra for free when you sign up for a 2-year deal, and it's completely risk-free because Nord always offers a 30-day money-back guarantee. Thank you, Nord. Now back to the video. People have recently accused the FAA of being responsible for the shortages of air traffic controllers, as well as inadequate training of those, and on top of that, also for being too slow with implementing more clever systems to keep track of aircraft movements on the ground at busy airports. And these are all factors that might have led up to some of those well-publicized close calls that we have seen recently. When faced with that criticism, the FAA has always said that it just didn't have the funding from Congress to hire the people it needs to pay for more training and more of those airport systems. So how do we fix this? Well, Will Gisbond at The Air Current, which you should definitely check out if you haven't already, he has publicized a study on Trump's next moves based on Project 2025. That's a guide that Trump's party supposedly was planning to use in order to lay out the next government's transitions, first moves and strategy. One plan in there is to split the FAA away from the Department of Transportation, since it currently consumes most of the department's budget at the expense of other modes of transport. But the main idea is to split the air traffic control organization away from the FAA itself, and then to privatize it. So what would that mean then? Well, having air traffic control as a separate entity from the Aviation Safety Authority isn't actually unusual in itself. That's basically how things are already done on this side of the Atlantic. In Europe, we have EASA, the European Union Aviation Safety Agency, which, like the FAA, has the role of certifying, regulating and monitoring the aircraft manufacturers, airlines, pilots and a lot of other things. As its name suggests, EASA is an agency of the European Union, specifically the European Commission, but air traffic control in Europe doesn't fall under EASA's remit. Instead, that job belongs to Eurocontrol, which isn't just a separate body, it technically isn't a European Union entity at all. Eurocontrol is an international organization, and when it comes to funding, it charges airspace users, the airlines, for the flying that they do, and then they distribute the money to each member state whose airspace is overflown, keeping what it needs for its own operations. Eurocontrol has been evolving and operating more or less like this since the mid-1960s, so how would such a setup work in the United States? Well, for one thing, it obviously wouldn't be international, but even as a private entity, it could theoretically be a non-profit organization that would vary its charges to airspace users in order to ensure that it always has the funding that it actually needs. In practice, a private US air traffic control group like this could either be controlled by or at the very least be very heavily influenced by those who use the airspace, which is more than anyone else the airlines. And to be clear, this is far from a new idea. Trump actually endorsed a plan very similar to this during his previous term in office, but it didn't go through Congress, despite having wide support from airlines, pilot unions, and air traffic controller groups. But there was one influential group of pilots who were quite happy with the fact that the plan stalled, and that was the general aviation groups. Compared to Europe and other parts of the world, the United States has quite an active and vocal general aviation community that enjoys far lower costs in airspace and airport fees than general aviation pilots pay elsewhere. That, plus lower fuel costs, is a big part of why many European flight schools do a lot of their flight training over in the United States. But if the fees for making touch and goes or shooting an ILS approach at a regional airport are determined according to the needs of the airlines, well then general aviation pilots could expect their own airport fees and other related costs to rise to similar levels that pilots see in other parts of the world as well. Even though, now that I think about it, I believe that there is a waiver for the Eurocontrol's fees for general aviation aircraft under 2,000 kilos over in Europe, so I guess maybe something similar could be implemented there as well. Anyway, Trump will have control of both chambers of Congress when he takes charge in January, so this time it should be a lot easier for him to get this proposal, as well as the rest of his moves, voted through. But some other policy changes that we are likely to see won't necessarily need approval from Congress, at least not directly. And one of those has to do with airline mergers and acquisitions. Generally speaking, the Biden administration has been quite skeptical of such moves, mainly on competition grounds. You see, airlines that want to join forces no longer compete with each other, which means that passengers get fewer choices, and with fewer choices in a given route, ticket prices tend to go up. Last year, Biden's administration stopped the Northeast Alliance between American Airlines and JetBlue less than 2 years after it had started. And that alliance had involved code-sharing flights and allowing passengers to merge benefits from the two airlines' loyalty programs. The administration then also stopped JetBlue's acquisition of Spirit Airlines, but it did allow Alaska Airlines to buy Hawaiian, so mergers didn't stop completely. But here, Trump's administration is likely to take a much less interventionist stance and likely look at these kind of things more favorably, which could be a great thing for the big airlines and lead to more consolidation, but how it will impact consumers is a little bit less clear. Now, something that he will likely be looking much less favorably at is anything to do with alternative future fuels, like synthetic aviation fuel, SAF, or hydrogen. I've talked before about these type of fuels and the fact that they will be a key step in decarbonizing aviation. Hydrogen is a more technologically challenging step, both in terms of what we need to see in aircraft technologies and in radical changes in fuel production and supply. But the problem is that it will be practically impossible for such huge changes to happen without broad support, both from the private industry and state entities, which would very likely need to include subsidies and other similar moves. In a recent video I made, I explained that the United States is already lagging behind Europe in the funding of such projects, especially for hydrogen. And Trump's arrival is definitely not going to make that any better for those of us that wants to see more research being put into this. Now, some members of the Republican Party have historically supported some form of sustainability subsidies. Maybe not for environmental reasons, but because the development of these technologies stands to cause key financial benefits for companies and countries that develop them. But earlier this year, Trump reportedly criticized Biden's support for these type of initiatives, calling them a scam, and promised to reverse them when he came into office. Now, interestingly, those initiatives that Trump really dislikes also benefit electric vehicles and solar farm projects, including those made and operated by Tesla, whose owner, of course, is Elon Musk, now a key Trump ally. It also appears like several other Trump allies also benefit from EVs, solar projects, and other renewable initiatives, so it wouldn't surprise me if Trump magically finds a way to become a little bit more flexible here. We'll see. But one of the areas where Trump doesn't appear to be flexible at all is when it comes to tariffs.
Tariffs, 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 tariffs.
And that's something which is now making the entire world nervous, including, of course, the aviation industry. Tariffs were a key way for Trump to antagonize China during his previous stint as US president, and it seems like he's now keen to pick up where he left off. He has already announced plans for blanket tariffs of 10 to 20% for all US imports and as high as 60% on import from China. Now, I should mention here that Biden's administration didn't entirely remove all of those tariffs on China in 2021, but obviously Trump's return might see that these tariffs increase and expand massively. Now, as a general point, tariffs are generally paid by whoever buys the product. So for US imports, the additional costs are going to be paid for by American consumers. So I am guessing that the idea here is to force US companies to build their stuff domestically instead and thereby safeguard some jobs. But if a company originally made something in the United States and then decided to source it from somewhere else, well, then they likely did this to save money. Which means that if they switch back to domestic production, prices will also go up. And that's on top of whatever it costs to set up a new factory at home, all leading to higher domestic prices. Now, when it comes to the aviation world, one company that would immediately suffer from such tariffs would be Airbus. Airbus does assemble aircraft in the United States at its Alabama site, but most structural and other key parts for these jets come from production sites in Europe. And those parts would therefore be subject to Trump's new tariffs. Brazil's Embraer, who makes the giant fleets of regional aircraft that many of America's airlines rely on, would also suffer from the same tariffs. But it's not just them and Airbus that will have problems here. The same goes for Boeing. In addition to many raw materials that Boeing sources from abroad, the supply chain of its 787 also relies on several foreign suppliers in Italy, Japan, and elsewhere. And in fact, it was actually this, the international production chain, that caused Boeing to build its Dreamlifter fleet. But it gets worse, because inevitably, when one country imposes tariffs on another, the other countries will retaliate, imposing their own tariffs in return. And as it turns out, Europe is already preparing for that, while still hoping that Trump won't go through with his stated plan. Now, if all of this sounds a bit familiar to you, it's because we've seen this play out before, during Trump's first presidency. Trump then engaged Europe in a tariff war, and that whole thing actually started as a spat between Airbus and Boeing. Now, to be clear here, this was far from a new dispute. From around 2004 or so, Boeing had accused European countries of subsidizing the development of Airbus aircraft like the Airbus A380, which was absolutely true. But then Airbus accused US federal and Washington state officials of giving tax breaks and other incentives to Boeing, which was also true. More accusations then flew back and forth over the next few years, and for most of that time the matter was handled with official complaints through the World Trade Organization, which sometimes sided with one player and sometimes with the other. But eventually the dispute turned over into punitive tariffs. During Trump's first presidency, things got so out of hand that punitive tariffs didn't just involve aircraft anymore. Eventually they expanded to stuff like cheese, gym equipment, whiskey, casino tables, and basically anything that one side thought would be costly and damaging to the other, which is basically the whole point of a trade war. Now again, Trump has a lot of key allies that have business interests in Europe and other foreign countries, including China actually, so we don't know if he would follow through with all of these threats. But it seems that quite a lot of countries are taking these threats seriously and preparing accordingly, which could see prices for key products and services go up, including prices on flight tickets. Supply chains for aircraft engines and for maintenance centers are still recovering from the pandemic era challenges. So at this point, figuring out the full effects of a new trade war is far from straightforward. Probably one of the most overused lines I have made here on the channel is Boeing already have too many problems to deal with. And at the risk of sounding redundant, they really don't need to add new tariffs to that list. But what do you think? What other effects are you looking out for when Trump enters the White House in January? Let me know here in the comments below, and let's keep it civil. One of the things that I value most from constructive discussions is the ability to disagree without stooping to personal attacks. And I expect that from you guys as well down in the comment section. Now I hope that you found this video interesting and enlightening, because that's what we always try to do here on Mentor Now. And if you did, please subscribe. Also, consider joining my fantastic Patreon crew if you want to support what we do, but also if you want to discuss these type of things directly with me in one of our Zoom hangouts. You might have noticed that we have been sneaking some awesome artwork into our recent videos. Well, they are actually real posters that you can get right now over on our artwork store. By transforming Mentor content into beautiful, meaningful art, we're trying to build a sustainable future for the channel as a whole, which would mean that we can put even more work into our mission of making aviation safer for everyone. So, if you want to support that, whilst also bringing a little bit of aviation magic to your own home, then follow the link here below. Also, make sure that you tag me on Instagram, that's mentor_pilot, if you pick up a poster. That would be really awesome. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.